Welcome back to another session on my Caribbean and Latin American news. Now, be sure to like and to share and to subscribe. Now, the topic for this afternoon's program is Zone of Peace versus Zone of War, Brazil's call versus US jungle training. At the CELAC EU summit, Brazil's president, that is Lula da Silva, called for Latin America and the Caribbean to remain a zone of peace. But behind the scenes, the United States is training soldiers in Panama in jungle warfare across the region. Meanwhile, Trinidad and Tobago warned that Caribbean is no longer a zone of peace due to rising crime and external interference. So what's really happening? Is this about regional security, or are we watching the early stages of a proxy war between the United States and rivals in Latin America? In this CLANN investigation, that's Latin America, Caribbean, and Latin America News Now, we expose the hidden power games behind CELAC EU diplomacy, why the US is quietly expanding its military footprint, and how Brazil is trying to build a peace bloc independent of Washington, and what it all means for the Caribbean and Latin Americans' future. Okay? Now, at the CELAC EU summit this week, two completely different messages came out of the same room. Brazil's president stood tall and called for Latin America and the Caribbean to remain a zone of peace. But just hours later, the headlines shifted. Trinidad and Tobago warned that we're no longer living in one zone. In fact, it was at the same meeting that they decided that they no longer are living in the same zone. Trinidad is suggesting that we are living in a zone of war, while Lula da Silva of Brazil is intimating that we live in a zone and should continue to live in a zone of peace. Now, while the speeches were being made, the United States was quietly training troops in jungle justice or jungle warfare right here in our region in Panama to be specific. So which is it? Is it a zone of peace, or are we being prepared for war? Is Brazil's call for diplomacy genuine, or is the Caribbean being softened up while the big powers arm for the next proxy conflict? This afternoon on CLANN, we break down this mixed message, the hidden strategy, and what this all means for the future of Latin America and the Caribbean region. Now, this is so important. It's a very important topic because we're seeing where Trinidad is becoming almost a rogue state and unapologetic in its claims that it is liaising with Washington in the war against drugs, right, and human trafficking. But the fact of the matter is that we know, those of us who have been studying history, know that the United States controls drug trafficking and human trafficking to a great extent. So why is it that Trinidad is fooling herself into believing that we believe the narrative that she is dispersing to the world? We don't know. But what is interesting is that while at the same meeting at the CELAC EU summit held in Colombia, that Trinidad took a different stance from Brazil, the Prime Minister of Brazil. Okay, that is something very, very interesting. Now, we hear in the Guardian newspaper, they're saying that according to reports, Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva also condemned military deployments in the region and attacks on civilian vessels. And this is what he's saying. That's Lula da Silva of Brazil. And I quote, "We are a region of peace and wish to remain so. Democracies do not fight crime by violating international law," unquote, Lula said, expressing concern that recent events could undermine regional stability and calling for Latin America to remain a zone of peace. Okay? And his Cuban counterpart, that's Cuba's Vice President Salvador Valdez Mesa, echoed these concerns. Several top European leaders did not attend the meeting, including the President Emmanuel Macron, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. Some cited conflicting schedules, while there has also been speculation about a rift between summit host Petro and US President Donald Trump. But we know that the EU presidents, those referenced here, the president of France, the Chancellor of Germany, and the European Commission President Ursula or Ursula, we know that they are on the United States side in terms of its war against Venezuela. Okay, so we are not surprised that they would not have attended that particular meeting held in Colombia. But of course, as they're suggesting, there could be tensions between the president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, and Donald Trump and other actors, okay, in the game, because they're not all on one accord, even though they have to do the bidding of the United States, because Europe is also vassal states, particularly the Western European nations are vassal states of the United States. Now, there is an article that was published this morning in the anti-war newspaper. That's news.antiwar.com. And, it's a very good newspaper, well, online paper to read. And the title of the story is U.S. Troops to Train for Jungle Warfare in Panama for First Time in Decades. So we see that the war on Venezuela is in full swing, despite many times you're telling us that it's not going to happen. Sometimes it's going to happen. Oh, it's not going to happen. They're trying to confuse us and perhaps trying to allow Venezuela to let its guards down too. And the longer they also drag it out for, it's going to cost Venezuela a lot of money and a lot of human resources, right? So it's best, to wear them out and then attack. I think that's what the United States is doing. The U.S. War Department has begun sending conventional ground forces to Panama for training in jungle warfare for the first time in more than 2 decades, ABC News reported on Monday. News of the training in Panama comes amid a major U.S. military buildup in the Caribbean and a push toward a potential war with Venezuela, a country with vast jungles. So the United States understands that Venezuela has a lot of jungles. And in order to combat, they will have to familiarize the soldiers with fighting in jungles, right? That's what they're doing. A U.S. military official told ABC that the training in Panama is not intended to prepare troops for a potential mission in Venezuela, but President Trump has reportedly been reviewing options for attacking the country. So they're giving mixed signals as to, are they doing this for Venezuela or is it for another event? And they will tell you no. But obviously we know that it is so. Right, because one of the concerns has been that Venezuela does have a lot of jungles, a lot of mountains, and how is the United States going to maneuver its way in Venezuela, a vast country to a big country? It's like an island like Cuba, or it's much more. It's a bigger place. Now, while the U.S. hasn't sent enough forces to the Caribbean for a full-scale invasion of Venezuela, U.S. military planners reportedly do believe it has a sufficient force to seize strategic ports and airfields in Venezuela. According to a report by the New York Times, one of the options presented to President Donald Trump would involve sending troops to capture airfields or oil infrastructure inside the country. Okay? So that is what they're doing. They are trying to cement their strategic position and put in the necessary plans in place so that they can be more competent in launching a war against Venezuela for land invasion, as it were. Now, the fact is that the United States does not have to rely on U.S. troops to be sent to countries to combat warfare. There's a new strategy right now where they're using proxies, and they can train people even in Venezuela, in Trinidad, in Panama, in Jamaica, in other country, so that they can be used as proxies to fight America's war. Remember now in Haiti that, when they were launching the war on the gangs, that troops were sent from Jamaica, from Bahamas, I believe, from Kenya, right? So the United States doesn't need a lot of troops from the US soil to fight its wars. Again, it just has to pick proxies. And remember too that the United States has a bounty of $50 million on the head of Nicolas Maduro. That's a lot of money. And how many people need even 100,000, even 50,000 of that money, and who would be willing to betray even their national sovereignty? There are people out there like that. We don't endorse that behavior, but as I'm suggesting, that we have to also embrace the reality that there are people out there who will do it. They will do it, right? And that is the truth. That is the fact of the matter. That's the truth. That's the unadulterated truth. So we are seeing now that the United States is ramping up its war on Venezuela, while these countries in the region, like Brazil, is suggesting that we don't want war. And Brazil might not necessarily agree with Nicolas Maduro's leadership, but he understands that if the US is doing this to Venezuela, that it can do it tomorrow to Brazil, if they're not in agreement with what the Brazilian president is doing. Or if the Brazilian president desires that he is going to arrest the natural resources of his country in the interest of Brazilians, then the United States would also want to invade and to depose, to topple that particular president. So Latin American presidents understand that even though they might not be in agreement with Nicolas Maduro as president of Venezuela, but he is the legitimate president for now until there's another election and he is toppled, he is deposed, he is elected out of office. So they are weighing their options and they are treading very cautiously. And they are, even if they don't directly support Nicolas Maduro, they are supporting the rule of law, as Lula da Silva suggested, that you can't just shoot a speedboat in defiance of international law and expect us to agree with the method you are using to topple the government of Nicolas Maduro, to have regime change in Venezuela. All right, that's what he's saying. That is what he's saying. And we don't know how far this is going to go, but what I do know is that it seems to be that the United States is not backing down. It's not backing down. Every day you open the papers, there's a new sign, there's a new signal that it's sending to the world that it is serious about regime change in Venezuela. It's not going to be an easy thing. And some of you are telling me that, yeah, Venezuela has a lot of help, and I know that, from the Chinese and from the Russian, okay? From the Russians. One of the things I also have taught you is that don't be on these guys' side, because we don't know who is who and who there is a traitor, control opposition. We just have to look carefully at the developments. We hope that they will be able to protect the government of Nicolas Maduro for the maintenance of peace in the region. But if that is so, if there's a war among all of these nations, China, Venezuela, and China, Russia, Venezuela, and the United States, it can be deadly. And maybe some of the Western European nations will join in. And perhaps nuclear weapons might be used in the combat. And that is why Trump is suggesting that he is about to launch the testing of nuclear weapons. Because Russia, according to him, and China have launched their testing of nuclear weapons. Now, is he suggesting that that could be tested here in the Caribbean and Latin American region? That is a question that you and I have to ask ourselves. What do you think? Do you think that the war on Venezuela is in full swing? Do you think the Americans will win? Or do you think if Venezuela gets the help of China and Russia, that the United States could be sent packing? Please let me know your thoughts. Thank you so much for joining. I hope that you'd like, share, and subscribe. Like the video so the videos can be shared with as many people on the platform. And for those of you who'd like to make a monetary contribution, please, you can send it to my Cash App, the $MZTUCK9. the $MZTUCK9. Thank you so much for joining.